She took the seat before he could even reach the row. 1 second. Daniel Brooks was standing in the narrow aisle of Liberty Air Flight 728, his boarding pass folded once between his fingers, the low hum of the cabin filling his ears. The next second, a white-gloved hand brushed past him, a sharp shoulder cut in front of his chest, and a woman slid decisively into seat 1A, like she had been claiming it her entire life. "Oh no," she said, without looking up, already buckling in. "This one's mine." The words landed hard. Not loud, not shouted. Calm. Certain. The kind of certainty that came from decades of never being questioned. Daniel stopped. The aisle behind him clogged instantly. A man sighed. Somewhere farther back, a suitcase wheel banged against an armrest. The air smelled like leather and recycled oxygen. Daniel glanced down at the small black letters on the seat divider. 1A. He looked back at the woman. Early 60s. Silver blonde hair set perfectly in place, cashmere coat folded neatly on her lap, pearls at her throat. Her posture straight, territorial, practiced. "I believe that's my seat," Daniel said, voice even, low, the way you speak when you don't want to wake a sleeping storm. The woman finally looked up. Her eyes moved over him slowly. Not curious, evaluating. Shoes, jacket, face. She smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "No," she said. "It's not." She turned back toward the window, already dismissing him, as if the conversation had ended before it began. A flight attendant paused 2 rows up, frozen mid-step. Her name tag read Karen Lee. She watched, unsure whether to step in or step back. Around them, first-class passengers pretended not to stare, though every head tilted just enough to catch the scene. A man in a navy suit lowered his phone. An older couple exchanged a look that said, "Here we go again." Daniel took a breath. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, steady but present. This wasn't new, not really. Different faces, same moment. "My boarding pass says 1A, he said, unfolding it carefully, holding it out, not pushing it into her space. "Chicago to Denver." The woman laughed softly. A short sound. Polite. Almost kind. "That happens," she replied. "The system messes up. They give these seats away sometimes when they overbook." She glanced up again, this time with mild irritation. "You can take whatever they assigned you originally." "I was assigned this," Daniel said. She exhaled sharply and waved a hand, signaling the flight attendant without looking at her. "Excuse me, we have an issue." Karen Lee stepped forward, smile already in place, but tight around the edges. "What seems to be the problem, Mom?" "This gentleman is confused," the woman said. "He thinks this is his seat." Karen turned to Daniel. Her eyes flicked to his boarding pass, then to his face. "Sir, can I see your ticket?" He handed it to her. She studied it longer than necessary, turned it over, scanned the barcode again, even though boarding had already closed. "Huh," she murmured. The woman in the seat leaned back, crossing her arms. "I always sit here," she said. "Always. Every time I fly Liberty. It's practically my seat." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger. Recognition. Karen hesitated. She looked down the aisle toward the cockpit, then back at Daniel. "Sir, would you mind stepping aside for just a moment while we sort this out?" Behind him, someone cleared their throat loudly. "Come on," a voice muttered. "Some of us want to sit down." Daniel stepped half an inch to the side. Just enough. He watched as the woman in 1A adjusted the headrest, slow and deliberate, like she was settling in for the long haul. Her confidence filled the space. "You know," the woman said casually, not looking at Daniel, "there are certain standards in first class. It's not just about the ticket. It's about experience. Daniel's jaw tightened. Karen Lee shot her a quick glance but said nothing. Another flight attendant approached, older, grey at the temples. His name tag read Michael. He leaned in slightly, voice low. "What's going on?" "She's in my seat," Daniel said. Michael looked at the woman. "Ma'am, what does your boarding pass say?" She didn't pull it out. She didn't need to. "It says 1C, she admitted. "But that's not the point." Michael blinked. "Then this seat belongs to—" She cut him off. "I've been flying this airline since before half your staff was born. I know how this works." The cabin had gone quiet now. Not silent, but close, like a room holding its breath. Daniel could feel eyes on his back, could almost hear the judgments forming. Too calm, too quiet. Why isn't he pushing harder? Because he'd learned. Because pushing rarely helped. Michael glanced at Karen Lee. Karen glanced back at him. A silent exchange. Risk assessment. Customer complaint versus policy. Old loyalty versus unknown passenger.
"Sir," Karen said finally, lowering her voice, "would you be willing to take another seat while we finish boarding? We'll make it right."
Daniel stared at her, not angry, just tired. "This is my seat," he said again. The woman in 1A finally turned fully toward him. Her expression hardened. "Why are you making this difficult?" she asked. "People like you always do." The words dropped into the aisle like broken glass. Michael stiffened. Karen Lee inhaled sharply. Somewhere behind them, a woman whispered, "Oh my God." Daniel felt the heat rise then. Not explosive, slow, controlled. The kind that came from something older than the moment itself. "I'm not making anything difficult," he said. "I paid for this seat. I followed every rule." The woman scoffed. "You think money is the only rule?" That was when Daniel noticed the small Liberty Air lapel pin on her coat. Gold. Vintage. Something they hadn't issued in years. A relic. He looked past her, toward the cockpit door, still closed. Toward the airline logo stitched into the bulkhead. Toward the brand he had built, brick by brick, when no one thought it would survive. Not yet, he thought. Not now. Michael straightened. "Ma'am, sir, I'm going to get the captain." The woman smiled again, this time triumphant. "Please do," she said. "I'd love to explain this properly." Daniel stepped back into the aisle as Michael walked forward. Around him, the cabin slowly came back to life. Whispers, side glances, phones sliding discreetly into hands, not recording yet, but ready. Daniel folded his boarding pass once more and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window. Older now. Lines at the eyes, hair graying at the edges. Still standing. He didn't know how this would end. He only knew it wouldn't end the way she expected. Not this time. The captain did not come right away. Instead, the cockpit door stayed closed, sealed like a vault, while the cabin settled into an uneasy half-silence. The engines were still off. The plane hadn't pushed back. Time stretched thin, elastic, uncomfortable. Daniel remained standing in the aisle. He could feel the carpet fibers under the soles of his shoes, the faint vibration of air conditioning through the metal floor. His hands rested loosely at his sides. Calm on the surface. Beneath it, memories stirred. Across from him, Margaret Whitman adjusted her scarf, then her pearls, then the armrest. She avoided his eyes now, not because she doubted herself, but because she no longer needed to look at him. In her mind, the outcome was already decided. Men like him were temporary problems. Systems always corrected themselves. A man in the second row leaned toward his wife and whispered, "This is ridiculous." She shook her head, lips pressed tight, eyes flicking between Daniel and Margaret with visible discomfort. 2 rows back, a retired Air Force colonel recognized the posture immediately. The way Daniel stood. The way he didn't shrink or puff up, just held ground. The colonel folded his arms and waited. Karen Lee hovered near the galley, fingers fidgeting with her tablet. She kept glancing toward the cockpit, then back at Margaret, whose confidence radiated like heat. Karen had worked this job for 12 years. She'd seen seat disputes before. They always went one way. Michael returned first. His shoulders were stiff, his mouth drawn thin. "Captain Harris is reviewing the manifest," he said quietly, mostly to Karen. Margaret smiled. "Good." Daniel said nothing. A soft chime sounded. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, then returned to normal. The sound of a latch turned. The cockpit door opened. Captain Harris stepped out slowly. Tall, late 50s, silver at the temples, face set in the neutral mask of command. His eyes swept the cabin once, quickly assessing. Delay. Attention. Tension. "What's going on?" he asked. Michael spoke first. "Seat dispute, sir. Passenger in 1A claims it's hers. Boarding pass indicates 1C. Margaret turned in her seat to face him fully now. "Captain, thank God. I've been flying this airline for decades. I was told this would be handled." Captain Harris nodded politely. "Ma'am, I understand. Let me look at the paperwork." Karen handed him the tablet. He scrolled, slowly. His brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. Daniel watched his face. He knew that look. Not confusion. Calculation. "Mr. Brooks," the captain said, finally acknowledging him. Daniel met his gaze. "Yes, sir." "Your boarding pass scanned correctly for 1A. Yes." Margaret let out a sharp laugh. "That's not the point." Captain Harris turned to her. "Ma'am, with respect, that is exactly the point." Her smile faltered for the first time. Just a crack. "Captain, surely you understand. There's history here." He studied her now. The pin, the posture. The entitlement dressed up as tradition. "I understand there's a policy." She leaned forward. "And I understand this airline. I remember when Liberty Air was barely staying afloat. I supported it when no one else did." Daniel's eyes flicked to the bulkhead again. The stitched logo. The thread count he'd personally approved. The curve of the cabin wall that had cost him 3 sleepless nights and a boardroom fight. Captain Harris cleared his throat. "Ma'am, your assigned seat is 1C. Silence. Margaret's face tightened. "You are asking me to move?" "I am asking you to take the seat you were assigned." She looked around the cabin, gauging the audience. The murmurs, the watching eyes. She straightened her spine. "This is how you treat loyalty now." Karen Lee swallowed hard. Daniel felt the weight shift, the moment teetering. "I'm not moving," Margaret said. Her voice was still calm, but something brittle had entered it. "This seat was promised to me long before today." Captain Harris's jaw set. "Ma'am, no seat is promised beyond the boarding pass." She laughed again, louder this time. "You expect me to sit next to him after all this?" Daniel felt the word land before it was even finished. Him. Not sir, not passenger. Him. Captain Harris's eyes sharpened. "Ma'am." She waved a dismissive hand. "You know what I mean." A woman 3 rows back gasped softly. The retired colonel exhaled through his nose. Daniel spoke then, quietly, evenly. "Captain, I don't want special treatment. I just want my seat." The simplicity of it cut through the noise. Captain Harris looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted there. Recognition, maybe. Or respect. "Man," he said firmly now, "I need you to move to 1C so we can prepare for departure." Margaret stared at him, then at Daniel. Her eyes narrowed, searching for leverage. "If you force this," she said, lowering her voice, "you'll hear about it. I know people." Captain Harris did not flinch. "So do I."
The cabin went very still. Slowly, deliberately, Margaret unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood, smoothing her coat with shaking hands she tried to hide. As she stepped into the aisle, she leaned close to Daniel, voice barely audible. "You don't belong here," she said. Daniel met her gaze. His voice was just as quiet. "I built this place for people who never belonged anywhere else." She froze, just for a second. Then she laughed, sharp and disbelieving, and moved past him toward 1C. The captain turned to Daniel. "Sir, please take your seat." Daniel nodded. He stepped forward and sat down in 1A. The leather was cool beneath him, familiar, designed for long backs, for tired bodies, for dignity. As he fastened his seatbelt, he felt the cabin watching. Some with embarrassment, some with admiration, some with resentment. Margaret dropped into 1C heavily. Her hands trembled now, no longer hidden. She stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Captain Harris addressed the cabin. "Thank you for your patience. We'll be pushing back shortly."
He turned back toward the cockpit, but paused, looked at Daniel once more. "Sir," he said quietly, "we'll speak after landing." Daniel inclined his head. As the cockpit door closed, the engines began to hum, rising in pitch. The plane vibrated, subtle but powerful. Margaret stared at the seat back in front of her. Her mind raced. "Built this place." The words echoed, unwanted. Impossible. She shook her head, dismissing it. People said things when they were angry. But doubt had crept in, thin as a crack in ice. Daniel looked out the window as the plane began to taxi. The runway lights blurred into lines. His reflection stared back again, older, steady, unbroken. He knew what would come next. Not because he planned it, but because truth, once spoken, had a way of catching up. And when it did, it rarely arrived gently.
The aircraft leveled off above the cloud line, the world below dissolving into a soft white sheet, and the cabin settled into the artificial calm that only altitude could create. Daniel Brooks stared out the window, but he wasn't watching the sky. He was listening. The quiet clicks of seatbelts, the rustle of newspapers, the low murmur of voices trying to pretend nothing unusual had happened. He had learned long ago that silence after conflict was never empty. It carried residue. Margaret Whitman sat rigid in 1C, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes locked forward. She had not looked at Daniel again, not once. Her confidence had not vanished, but it had shifted, hardened into something defensive. The kind of posture people adopt when they tell themselves a story they need to believe. Karen Lee passed through the aisle with a tray of drinks, her movements careful, measured. When she reached Daniel's row, she paused a fraction longer than necessary. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?"
Her voice was polite, but softer now. "Just water, thank you," Daniel said. She nodded, poured it slowly, hands trembling just enough to notice. When she handed him the glass, her fingers brushed his for half a second. She flinched, then recovered. "I'm sorry about earlier," she said under her breath, not quite meeting his eyes. Daniel looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the fear there. Not of him, of the system, of being on the wrong side of it. "I understand," he said, and he meant it. She moved on quickly. Across the aisle, the retired colonel leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. watching Margaret with an expression that held no sympathy. He had seen this before too. Power mistaken for permanence, authority confused with entitlement. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. She could feel eyes on her now. The weight had changed. Before, people had looked away. Now, they watched. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn leather notebook, flipping it open with practiced familiarity. Inside were handwritten notes, dates, names. A habit from another era. She scanned the page without reading, her mind elsewhere. Built this place. The phrase echoed again, unwelcome. She tightened her grip on the notebook. Nonsense. People said ridiculous things when they were challenged. He was bluffing. Men like him always were. Still, doubt crept in. She pressed the call button above her seat. A soft chime sounded. Michael approached, his expression guarded. "Yes, ma'am?" "I'd like to speak to the captain again," Margaret said. Her tone was clipped, controlled. Michael hesitated. "Captain Harris is busy." "I insist." Michael glanced toward the cockpit, then back at her. "I'll let him know." As he walked away, Daniel felt the shift before it happened. The tightening of the air. The approach of another wave. Margaret leaned toward the aisle and caught Karen Lee's attention as she passed again. "Do you know who that man is?" she asked quietly. Karen froze. "Excuse me?" "The man in 1A. Karen swallowed. "He's a passenger, ma'am." Margaret scoffed. "That's not what he claimed." Karen's eyes flicked involuntarily toward Daniel, then back to Margaret. "What did he say?" Margaret leaned closer, voice low and sharp. "He said he built this airline." Karen felt her stomach drop. She laughed weakly. "That's not possible." "Isn't it?" Margaret said. Her eyes searched Karen's face now, probing. "You work here. You must know." Karen straightened. "Liberty Air was founded over 30 years ago." "Yes, and men don't always stay in the spotlight forever," Margaret said, "especially not men like him." Karen felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Ma'am, I really need you to—" "Check," Margaret snapped. "Just check." Karen hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see what I can find." She moved toward the galley, heart pounding. She pulled out her tablet, fingers shaking as she accessed the internal directory. Founder, executive history. Names scrolled past, old photos, board reshuffles. Then she saw it. Daniel Brooks, founder and chief executive officer. Status, active. Visibility, low. Her breath caught. She stared at the screen, then at the name again, as if it might change. It didn't. Michael noticed her expression as he returned from the cockpit. "What's wrong?" She turned the tablet toward him, his face drained of color. "Oh," he whispered. The captain stepped out moments later, alerted by the sudden urgency. Karen handed him the tablet without a word. Captain Harris read, slowly, thoroughly. Then he closed his eyes. Margaret watched the exchange from her seat, chest tightening. Something was happening. Something she could feel but not yet see. Captain Harris walked down the aisle, stopping beside Daniel's seat. He leaned in slightly, voice low. "Mr. Brooks." Daniel turned to him. "I owe you an apology," the captain said quietly. "And a conversation." Margaret's blood ran cold. Daniel nodded once. After landing, Captain Harris straightened and turned toward the cabin. His voice carried, calm but unmistakably authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your patience today. We'll be making our final approach shortly." He paused. His eyes flicked, briefly, to Margaret. Margaret's hands began to shake. Karen returned to her station, heart hammering. She avoided Margaret's gaze. Margaret leaned back in her seat, pulse roaring in her ears. The notebook slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. She didn't reach for it. Built this airline. The words were no longer dismissible now. They pressed in from all sides, reinforced by silence, by posture, by the way the crew had shifted around him. Daniel sat calmly, reading a folded document from his briefcase. He did not look at her. He did not need to. Margaret swallowed hard. Her mouth felt dry. She had spent her life believing she understood how power worked, who held it, who deserved it. She had been wrong. The aircraft began its descent, the nose dipping gently. Outside, the clouds parted, revealing the grid of a city waiting below. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. The world had not ended, but something inside her had cracked. Daniel felt the wheels touch the runway, a firm, grounding jolt. He exhaled slowly. The hardest part was not confrontation. It was aftermath. As the plane taxied, the cabin buzzed again, phones coming out openly now. Whispers grew louder. "That's him. No way. Did you hear what he said?" Margaret stared straight ahead, her reflection faint in the window. Pale, older than she remembered. When the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt sign chimed off, Captain Harris stood once more at the front of the cabin. "Mr. Brooks," he said clearly, "if you'd allow me a moment before deplaning." Every head turned. Daniel stood slowly, with the weight of the moment settling fully into the space. Margaret turned at last, her eyes wide, her certainty finally gone. For the first time since boarding, she looked at Daniel not as an obstacle, not as an intruder, but as something else entirely. As consequence. And she knew, with sudden clarity, that whatever came next, there would be no seat she could hide in. The aisle opened as if by instinct when Daniel stepped forward, bodies shifting aside without a word, a narrow path clearing through first class that hadn't existed for him before. Captain Harris waited near the bulkhead, posture rigid, hands clasped behind his back. The cockpit door stood open now, no longer a barrier, but an invitation. The hum of the engines softened as ground crew connected to the jet bridge, a hollow metallic thud echoing through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, voice steady but weighted. "Please remain seated for a moment. We have a brief internal matter to address." That was all it took. Phones appeared openly now, not hidden, not discreet. Screens glowed in the dim cabin light. People leaned into the aisle, curiosity sharpening into anticipation. Daniel stopped beside the captain. He could feel the eyes on his back, the shift in gravity. This was the moment he never rushed. Power, real power, worked best when it didn't need to announce itself. Captain Harris turned to face the cabin fully. "Mr. Daniel Brooks is the founder and chief executive officer of Liberty Air." The words landed without ceremony, but they detonated all the same. A collective intake of breath rippled through the cabin. Someone whispered his name aloud, testing it. A man in the second row swore under his breath. The retired colonel nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if a long-held suspicion had finally been confirmed. Margaret Whitman felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands clutched the armrests, knuckles whitening. The cabin blurred at the edges, sound collapsing inward until all she could hear was the echo of her own breath. Founder. Chief executive. The airline. Her airline. No, not hers. Never hers. Daniel didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He felt the weight of her realization as surely as he felt the floor beneath his feet. Captain Harris continued. "Mr. Brooks has been traveling incognito as part of an internal review. The incident that occurred prior to departure has been documented." Documented. The word cut deeper than any accusation. Karen Lee stood frozen near the galley, tablet pressed to her chest. Her throat tightened. 12 years of service, and she had nearly asked the man who signed her paycheck to step aside to keep the peace. Michael stared at the floor, shame flushing his face. Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her world had not shattered in a dramatic explosion. It had simply slipped out from under her, leaving nothing solid to stand on. Daniel finally turned toward the cabin. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately, taking in faces. Curiosity, discomfort, regret. He let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "I didn't come here to make an example of anyone," he said. His voice was calm, resonant, the kind that carried without effort. "I came to see what happens when no one knows who I am." He paused, eyes flicking briefly toward Margaret. Not with anger, with disappointment. "Now I know." A murmur rippled through the rows. Captain Harris stepped aside, giving Daniel the space. The gesture did not go unnoticed. Daniel addressed the crew first. "This airline was built on the idea that dignity isn't a perk. It's the baseline." His eyes settled on Karen, then Michael. "When conflict feels uncomfortable, that's not a reason to avoid it. It's usually a reason to pay attention." Karen swallowed hard and nodded, eyes glistening. Daniel turned slightly, his attention shifting, narrowing. Margaret felt it like a physical pressure. "Ms. Whitman," he said. Her name sounded different now, smaller. She looked up, her eyes wide. Her carefully constructed composure finally fractured. "I didn't know," she said quickly, the words tumbling over each other. "I swear I had no idea who you were." "I believe you," Daniel replied. The relief on her face was instant, short-lived. "That's the problem." The cabin went utterly silent. Daniel's voice remained steady. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect." Margaret's breath hitched. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Around them, passengers watched with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. This wasn't spectacle. This was reckoning. Captain Harris spoke again, measured and professional. "Ms. Whitman, due to your conduct prior to departure, Liberty Air will be filing a formal incident report. Further review will follow." Margaret nodded frantically. "Of course, I understand. I've always supported this airline. I've defended it for years." Daniel studied her. Support isn't measured by loyalty points. That was the moment her shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of her completely. As deplaning began, passengers rose slowly, gathering bags, casting glances at Daniel as they passed. Some nodded. Some avoided his eyes. One woman paused briefly and said, "Thank you," before moving on. Margaret remained seated. The cabin emptied around her, the noise receding until only the soft whir of ventilation remained. She stared at the Liberty Air logo stitched into the seatback, seeing it now with different eyes. No longer a symbol of belonging, but of exclusion she had enforced without ever questioning it. Daniel stood near the jet bridge, speaking quietly with Captain Harris. When the last passenger passed through, the captain nodded and stepped away, giving them privacy. Daniel turned back toward the cabin. Margaret was still there, small in her seat, hands folded tightly, posture collapsed inward. He walked toward her. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of anger, but because he knew this moment would stay with her far longer than any punishment. He stopped beside her row. She looked up at him, eyes wet, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." "I know," he said. "That doesn't fix it," she said. The words came out raw now, stripped of defensiveness. "I thought I understood how the world worked." Daniel nodded slowly. "Most people do, until they don't." She swallowed hard. "What happens now?" Daniel considered her. The question wasn't about policy. It was about identity. "That depends on what you do after today," he said. He stepped back, giving her space, not absolution. Margaret remained seated long after he turned away, the cabin empty, the silence absolute. The weight of her own actions settled fully into place, heavy and unavoidable. Outside, the terminal buzzed with life, indifferent and unrelenting. Daniel stepped onto the jet bridge, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. The airline he built would continue to fly. The question was whether the people within it would change with it. The terminal swallowed them in noise and motion, the sharp scent of coffee and jet fuel replacing the recycled stillness of the cabin. Daniel walked with measured steps, his briefcase hanging at his side, his posture unchanged. Around him, Liberty Air employees straightened instinctively when they recognized him, then froze, unsure whether acknowledgement was welcome or dangerous. A gate supervisor stopped mid-sentence. A ground agent lowered his radio. Respect, delayed but unmistakable, rippled outward. Margaret followed several paces behind, moving more slowly than she had when she boarded. Her shoulders were rounded now, the careful armor of confidence slipping piece by piece. People glanced at her without recognition, without judgment, and somehow that hurt more. She'd always believed shame required an audience. She was learning it could thrive in anonymity. Captain Harris broke away toward operations, already speaking into his phone, voice clipped, procedural. Karen Lee lingered near the jet bridge entrance, fingers clasped together, watching Daniel like someone witnessing the aftermath of a near collision. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly. He stopped. "I want you to know," she continued, swallowing. "I should have handled that differently." Daniel studied her face. He saw the exhaustion there, the years of small compromises mistaken for survival. "You're not the first," he said, "but you'll decide if you're the last." Her eyes filled. She nodded once, sharply, and stepped back. Security did not approach Margaret. No sirens, no dramatic removal. The consequence was quieter, heavier. An incident report was already moving through internal channels. Names, timestamps, statements. The machinery of accountability had begun to turn. Margaret felt it, even without seeing it. The way the crew avoided her gaze now. The way no one rushed to reassure her. The way the space around her felt suddenly vast and empty. Daniel turned toward the executive corridor that cut behind the main concourse, a route few passengers ever noticed. He hesitated, then glanced back. Margaret was standing alone by the windows, staring out at the runway. Her reflection stared back at her, older than she remembered, eyes hollowed by something deeper than embarrassment. "Walk with me," Daniel said. She looked up, startled. "I don't deserve that." "No," he said evenly. "But you might need it." They walked side by side, not close, not distant. Two lives briefly aligned by consequence. The hallway quieted around them, sound dampened by carpet and glass. "I built Liberty Air because I was tired of watching people be invisible," Daniel said. He didn't look at her as he spoke. Invisible to systems that claimed to serve them. Margaret's hands twisted together. "I never thought of myself that way," she murmured, "as someone who made others invisible." "That's usually how it works," Daniel replied. They stopped near a framed photograph on the wall, an old one, grainy. A younger Daniel stood beside a small propeller plane, smiling despite exhaustion, surrounded by a handful of employees. Margaret recognized the era. She had flown Liberty Air back then. Cheap fares, cramped seats, hope stitched into every delay. "I defended this airline," she said quietly, "when people mocked it, when they said it wouldn't last." "I know," Daniel said. "Support can coexist with harm." The words landed gently, but they stayed. A phone vibrated in Daniel's pocket. He glanced at the screen, then silenced it. "The board will want a briefing," he said. "They'll get it." Margaret's breath caught. Am I going to lose everything? Daniel considered her.
Not the woman from the seat, the person beneath it.
"You're going to lose the illusion that you are entitled to more than others," he said. "What happens beyond that depends on how honest you're willing to be." They stood there for a moment longer, the hum of the airport pressing in. "Thank you," Margaret said finally. The words were small, real. Daniel nodded once and turned away. As he entered the executive wing, the doors closing softly behind him, the weight he had been carrying shifted, not lifted, repositioned. He knew the work wasn't done. It never was. Inside the conference room, screens flickered to life. Faces appeared. Familiar, serious. The board chair spoke first. "We saw the report." "I'm sure you did," Daniel replied, setting his briefcase down. "We need to address optics," another voice added. Daniel leaned forward, hands flat on the table. "We need to address behavior." Silence followed. Not resistance. Recognition.
Back in the terminal, Margaret remained by the window long after he disappeared. Flights departed. Arrivals streamed in. Life moved on, indifferent to her unraveling. She opened her notebook again, flipping to a blank page. Her hand trembled as she wrote. Not names this time, but a single sentence, slow and deliberate. "I was wrong." She closed the book and exhaled, the sound shaky but steadying. Across the airport, Karen Lee filed her statement, every word precise, unflinching. Michael added his own, shoulders squared, voice firm. The incident spread quietly through internal channels, not as gossip, but as case study. Daniel watched the city through his office window later that evening, lights blinking on as dusk settled. He thought of the man he had been when Liberty Air was just an idea, and of the man he was now, carrying the weight of what that idea had become. He knew there would be backlash, commentary, opinions sharpened by distance. He also knew something else had shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but unmistakably. Margaret boarded her return flight hours later, seat deep in economy, hands folded, posture humble. No one noticed her. She didn't expect them to. As the plane lifted into the darkening sky, she closed her eyes, the hum of the engines vibrating through her bones. The seat was smaller, less forgiving. It felt, for the first time, exactly right. And somewhere above the clouds, two lives continued forward on altered trajectories, bound not by confrontation alone, but by the long, difficult work of seeing clearly. The story did not stay inside the airport. By the time Daniel reached his office overlooking the city, the first messages had already begun to stack up. Not headlines yet, not outrage, just fragments. A text from legal asking for a call, an email from communications marked urgent, a voicemail from an old colleague who never called unless something was burning. Daniel set his briefcase down and loosened his tie. Outside the glass, traffic crawled along the river of lights, steady and indifferent. He had known this moment would come. Every truth eventually leaked, even the quiet ones. He did not check social media. He never did. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water and sat, letting the silence settle. Leadership, he had learned, was often about waiting long enough for the right noise to surface. It came sooner than expected. Daniel. The voice on the speaker was measured, professional, edged with concern. "We have a situation." "I assumed we would," he replied. "The incident report is circulating beyond internal channels. A passenger filed a complaint." "Not the woman. Another one." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "What's the claim?" "Discriminatory treatment." "Against you?" He opened his eyes. "Against me?"
Yes. The passenger alleges that the airline favored you over another customer based on position. Daniel let out a slow breath. There it was. The counter-narrative. The familiar pivot.
Let it circulate, he said. Truth holds up better than panic.
On the other side of the city, Margaret Whitman sat alone in her living room, the television on but muted. The room was immaculate. Family photos lined the mantel. Holiday cards from people she had not spoken to in years stood propped in neat rows. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She stared at it without picking it up. The first call had been from a former co-worker. The second, from a woman she played cards with on Thursdays. By the fifth, she understood. Word traveled faster than facts. Someone on that plane had talked. Someone always did. She finally answered. "Margaret," the voice said carefully, "is it true?" Margaret closed her eyes. "Yes." Silence followed. Not accusation. Something worse. Distance. After she hung up, she sat very still, the weight of her own certainty collapsing inward. She had spent years believing she was protecting standards, defending order. Now she saw how easily that story had justified cruelty. Back at Liberty Air headquarters, the board convened in a closed session. Faces filled the screen, some familiar, some tense. This could become public, the communications director warned. We need to be proactive. Daniel leaned back in his chair. We need to be honest. That's not always the same thing, someone replied. Daniel met their gaze through the camera. It has to be. He laid out the facts calmly. The seat, the delay, the language, the failure to intervene quickly enough. He did not soften it. He did not dramatize it. He told it the way it had happened. This is not about one woman, he said. It's about what happens when people assume authority instead of earning it. Silence followed. Not resistance. Consideration. Then what do you propose? The board chair asked. Daniel folded his hands. We change how we respond. Immediately. Clear escalation protocols. Mandatory intervention when language crosses a line. No exceptions for loyalty status. No exceptions for age. Someone frowned. That will upset some customers. Daniel nodded. It already has. The difference is who we choose to protect. The vote was not unanimous. It never was. But it passed. That evening, an internal memo went out. Short, direct, unambiguous. It did not mention names. It did not mention the incident. It did not need to. Margaret saw it the next morning, when a former colleague forwarded it with a single line. I think this is about you. She read it twice, then again. Her chest tightened, not with anger, but with a strange, unwelcome clarity. Systems changed because people like her had been allowed to dominate them for too long. She thought of Daniel's words. Support can coexist with harm. For the first time in years, she did not argue back. Across town, Daniel walked through the training floor when new hires practiced de-escalation scenarios. He stopped, watching as a young flight attendant faced a simulated confrontation, voice firm but calm, body positioned protectively beside an invisible passenger. Good, Daniel said quietly. The trainee startled. Sir, I didn't see you there. That's all right, he replied. You handled it well. She smiled, pride flickering across her face. Thank you. He moved on, the sound of practiced empathy following him down the hall. By afternoon, the story broke. Not as scandal, not as spectacle, as commentary. A column about power and perception. About how authority looks different depending on who holds it. The writer did not name Margaret, did not name Daniel, but the outline was unmistakable. Daniel read it once, then closed the browser. Margaret read it 3 times. Her hands shook by the end. She did not defend herself. Not online, not to friends. She cancelled her card game, declined invitations, sat with the discomfort she had avoided her entire life.
That night, she opened her notebook again. This time, she wrote more than one sentence. She wrote about the seat, about the certainty she had mistaken for truth, about the moment the ground shifted beneath her. She did not know what she would do with the words. She only knew she needed them outside her head. Weeks passed. The noise softened. The airline moved forward. Changes took root quietly, stubbornly. One morning, Daniel received a handwritten letter, no return address. He opened it slowly. It was brief, careful, unadorned. I am not writing to ask forgiveness. I am writing to acknowledge harm. I thought my experience gave me authority. I see now how narrow that view was. I am trying to do better. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I am trying. Signed only, Margaret. Daniel folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer, not as a trophy, as a reminder. That afternoon, he boarded another flight. Different route, different city. Same seat assignment. As he walked down the aisle, a flight attendant caught his eye and smiled, not with recognition, but with professionalism. A small thing, the right thing. Daniel took his seat and buckled in, the quiet hum of the cabin settling around him. Outside, the plane began to move, carrying with it not just passengers, but the slow, deliberate shift of something deeper. Change, he knew, was rarely loud, but it was relentless. 6 months later, winter pressed against the glass walls of Liberty Air headquarters, turning the city outside into a muted palette of steel and grey. Daniel Brooks stood alone in the executive conference room, long after the others had left. The chairs were neatly pushed in, the screens dark. On the table lay a thin stack of reports, their corners aligned with deliberate care. Complaints, commendations, incident logs, patterns emerging where silence used to live. He ran a hand over the tabletop, feeling the faint grooves left by years of use. This room had once been a battlefield. Now it felt more like a workshop. The changes had not come easily. They never did. Some long-time customers had written angry letters, accusing the airline of abandoning tradition, of bending to social pressure. A handful had taken their business elsewhere. Daniel had read every message himself, not to argue, but to understand where fear disguised itself as nostalgia. What surprised him were the other letters, the ones written in careful cursive, mailed instead of emailed. Passengers in their 60s and 70s thanking the airline for intervening when a man was shouted down for his accent, or when a woman was mocked for her clothes. Veterans, retirees, grandparents traveling alone. People who had lived long enough to recognize quiet dignity when they saw it. On the far side of the city, Margaret Whitman folded laundry at her kitchen table, the radio murmuring softly in the background. The routine steadied her hands. She moved more slowly these days, not from age, but from attention. Every action considered, every assumption questioned. She had resigned from the advisory council at the airport. No dramatic announcement, just a letter, handwritten, explaining that she needed time away. Some members had responded with warmth, others with silence. She accepted both. Margaret paused, holding a neatly folded shirt. Her notebook lay open beside her, pages filled now. Not confessions, observations. Moments she had once dismissed and now examined closely. She had started volunteering twice a week at a community travel assistance center near the old train depot. Mostly seniors, mostly people confused by forms and schedules and digital systems that had moved faster than they could. Margaret sat with them patiently, her voice gentler than it had been in years. "Take your time," she told them. "There's no rush." Each time she said it, she meant it more.
Back at Liberty Air, Daniel walked through the terminal unnoticed, coat collar turned up against the cold. He liked it this way. Anonymous, observant. The truest measure of progress was what happened when no one was watching. Near Gate 21, a disagreement unfolded quietly. A man with a heavy southern accent argued with a gate agent over a seat assignment. His voice rose, frustration spilling out. Before it could tip, another agent stepped in, positioning herself between him and the counter, voice calm, steady. "Sir, let's take a breath," she said. "We'll fix this together." Daniel slowed his pace, watching. The tension eased. The man nodded. The agent smiled, not triumphant, just present. Daniel continued walking, something warm settling in his chest. That evening, a staff meeting filled the auditorium. Flight attendants, pilots, ground crew, new hires and veterans alike. Daniel stood at the podium, not elevated, not distant. "I want to thank you," he said. Not for being perfect, for being willing. He spoke about the incident without naming it, about the cost of silence, about the difference between comfort and safety. He spoke slowly, choosing words that landed rather than dazzled. This airline was never about seats, he said. It was about who we decide belongs. Applause followed, not roaring, sustained, earned. Margaret watched the meeting online later that night, a link sent by someone who knew she would. She sat on her couch, blanket pulled around her shoulders, listening to Daniel's voice carry conviction without anger. She did not cry. She did not smile. She simply watched, absorbing the truth she had once resisted. When the video ended, she turned off the television and sat in the quiet. The house felt different now, less like a fortress, more like a place where reflection could live. She picked up her phone and typed a message, then erased it. Typed again, sent it this time. "Thank you for not turning that moment into a spectacle. It would have been easier. This was harder. And better." Daniel read the message the next morning before his first meeting. He did not reply right away. Some words did not need answers. Some needed space. Weeks later, Liberty Air announced a new initiative quietly, without press releases or slogans. A partnership with regional travel centers to support older passengers navigating modern systems. Training led by people who had lived the experience, not just studied it. Margaret saw the flyer posted at the community center. She stared at it for a long moment, then signed up to help. On a crisp spring morning, Daniel boarded a flight bound for a small Midwestern city. No first class this time. Coach. Middle seat. He welcomed the discomfort. It reminded him where he had started. An elderly woman struggled with her carry-on in the overhead bin. Before anyone else could move, Daniel stood and lifted it easily, securing it with care. "Thank you," she said, relief softening her voice. "Of course," he replied. She studied him for a moment. "You have a kind face," she said simply. Daniel smiled and sat down. As the plane lifted into the air, sunlight breaking through the clouds, he closed his eyes briefly, listening to the steady rhythm of flight. Progress was not a straight line. It curved. It doubled back. It required patience. Margaret spent that same morning at the center, guiding a man through a digital boarding pass on his phone, her finger hovering just long enough for him to follow. When he finally nodded, understanding settling in, she felt something loosen inside her. Not forgiveness. Alignment. Across the sky, the aircraft carried its passengers forward, suspended between where they had been and where they were going. Daniel opened his eyes and looked out the window, the land unfolding below. Change, he thought, was not about erasing the past. It was about choosing, again and again, to move differently through the present. The first call came before sunrise, the phone vibrating softly against the wooden nightstand, while the city outside Daniel's window still slept. He reached for it without opening his eyes, already sensing the tone before a word was spoken. Not urgency, not crisis. Something heavier, something that lingered. "Daniel," the voice said quietly. It was the General Counsel. "We received a formal notice overnight." Daniel sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. "From who?" "From a passenger advocacy group. They want a meeting, not hostile, but serious." Daniel looked toward the window where the sky was beginning to thin from black to grey. "Schedule it," he said. "I'll be there." Across town, Margaret Whitman woke to the sound of the radio announcing delays at the airport. Weather moving in from the west. She sat at the edge of her bed for a long moment before standing, her joints stiff, her thoughts already active. She dressed simply now. No jewelry, no statement pieces. Just a sweater, slacks, sensible shoes. She checked her calendar taped to the refrigerator. Community center at 9, travel assistance workshop at 11. She paused, then added a note in the margin. Advocacy meeting. Listen only. The meeting room at Liberty Air was smaller than the boardroom, intentionally so. No long table, chairs in a loose circle, coffee set off to the side, untouched. Daniel arrived early. He always did. He read the room before anyone else entered, noting exits, light, acoustics. Habits formed early, stayed late. When the representatives arrived, they came without fanfare. 3 of them. 2 women, 1 man. All over 60. All composed. They carried folders, not phones. "We appreciate you meeting with us," the oldest woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Eleanor Price." Daniel shook it firmly. "I'm glad you reached out." They sat. No one rushed to speak. Eleanor opened her folder. "We've received an increase in reports over the last year. Subtle things. Dismissive language. Assumptions. Most often involving older passengers and passengers of color." Daniel nodded. "We've seen the same data. What's different," the man added, "is that people are starting to report it. That tells us something has shifted." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "It tells me they believe someone will listen." Eleanor studied him carefully. "Do you?" "Yes," he said, "even when it's uncomfortable." She closed the folder. "Then we'd like to work with you. Not on messaging, on practice." Daniel felt a quiet relief settle in. This was the work, not applause, not headlines. This. That afternoon, Margaret sat in a folding chair at the community center, listening as a woman described being moved from her seat because someone else complained she didn't look like she belonged in first class. Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. She did not interrupt. She did not explain. She listened. When it was her turn to speak, she did not introduce herself beyond her name. "I used to think experience meant authority," she said slowly. "Now I think it means responsibility." The room was quiet. Not judgmental. Attentive. Later, as chairs were stacked and people filtered out, a young volunteer approached her. "You're really good at this," she said, "helping people feel seen." Margaret smiled faintly. "I'm learning." Weeks passed. The collaboration grew. Training sessions expanded. New language entered the manuals. Not corporate jargon. Plain words, clear boundaries. Daniel visited one session unannounced. He stood at the back as a facilitator asked a simple question. "What do you do when someone uses their history as a weapon?" The room hesitated. Then a flight attendant raised her hand. "You acknowledge their experience," she said, "but you don't let it override someone else's dignity." Daniel nodded to himself. Margaret read about the initiative in the local paper.
No names, no photos. Just a quiet acknowledgement that Liberty Air was changing how it handled conflict in the air. She clipped the article and placed it inside her notebook. One evening, Daniel received an email forwarded from customer relations. A handwritten letter had been scanned. It was from a retired schoolteacher. She described being defended by a gate agent when another passenger mocked her for needing extra time to board. The letter ended simply, "I felt safe." Daniel closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Safe. That word had cost him years. Lawsuits, skepticism, compromise. It was worth it. Margaret sat at her kitchen table that same evening, writing by the light of a single lamp. Her handwriting had grown steadier, more intentional. She wrote about the seat again, but this time, not as a symbol of loss, as a turning point. A moment where certainty failed, and something better took its place. She did not know if anyone would ever read these pages. That was no longer the point. On a late spring flight, Daniel sat near the back, listening as two passengers talked quietly about the airline. One mentioned the changes. The other shrugged. "Feels calmer," he said, "like someone's paying attention." Daniel looked out the window as the plane climbed. The ground fell away slowly, deliberately. Change was not dramatic from this height. It was gradual, almost invisible. But it held. And far below, in homes and meeting rooms and quiet moments of recognition, people were moving through the world just a little differently than they had before. The invitation arrived in a thick cream envelope, the kind that suggested gravity before it was even opened. Daniel Brooks held it between his fingers for a long moment before breaking the seal. The return address was familiar. Washington. Formal, deliberate. He read the letter once, then again, slower the second time. A closed-door forum. Transportation equity. Senior leaders only. No press. He folded the paper and set it on his desk, the city humming faintly beyond the glass. This was how change tried to solidify itself. Not with applause, but with rooms full of people who had something to lose. Margaret Whitman received her own envelope 2 days later, slipped through the mail slot with a dull thud that echoed through her quiet house. She stared at it from across the room, heart quickening in a way she didn't fully understand. Her name, typed cleanly. No titles. She opened it carefully. Observer status. Community representative. Requested presence. She sat down heavily, the letter trembling in her hands. For months now, she had learned to sit with discomfort. This felt different. This felt like being seen without being shielded. The forum took place in a federal building just off the mall, all marble floors and high ceilings that made voices carry whether they wanted to or not. Security was efficient, polite, impersonal. Daniel arrived early, as always. He nodded to familiar faces, CEOs, regulators, union representatives, people who had shaped the industry from opposite sides of the same table. Margaret arrived quietly and took a seat near the back. She wore a simple navy jacket, hair pulled back. No pearls, no armor. When Daniel stepped to the podium, the room stilled. He did not begin with data. He did not lead with policy. He told a story. Not the story everyone expected, not the seat, not the confrontation. He spoke instead about a baggage handler who had intervened when a passenger was mocked for needing help. About a gate agent who chose to step in early, even when it meant risking a complaint. These moments don't show up in quarterly reports, Daniel said, but they determine who feels safe enough to fly. He spoke without accusation, without spectacle. The room listened. Margaret watched from her seat, her chest tight. She recognized herself in the margins of his words, not as a villain, as a warning. When the floor opened for discussion, the first voices were cautious. Legal concerns, cost implications, customer retention metrics.
Then an older man stood, leaning heavily on the table. "I've been in this industry 40 years, he said. "We've confused comfort with correctness for too long." Murmurs followed. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. During the break, Daniel stepped aside near a window overlooking the reflecting pool. He felt the familiar ache in his shoulders, the weight of carrying both vision and consequence. Margaret approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. "I didn't know if I should," she said softly. Daniel turned. He did not look surprised. "You're here," he said. "That matters." She nodded, eyes flicking toward the room.
"Listening is harder than I thought."
"It usually is," he replied. They stood in silence for a moment, the distance between them not gone, but changed. "I've been working at a center," Margaret said, "helping people navigate travel. Seniors, mostly. People who get dismissed." Daniel watched her carefully. And I hear myself in some of the things they describe," she said. "That's been the hardest part." He nodded. "It doesn't get easier. It gets clearer." The forum resumed. Panels followed. Commitments were made carefully, hedged but real. Pilot programs, shared standards, accountability frameworks. By the end of the day, no one claimed victory, but no one left unchanged. That evening, Daniel walked alone along the Mall, the monuments lit against the dark. He thought of the first plane he had leased, the first route he had begged investors to fund, the long nights wondering if he was wrong. He knew now that building something was not the same as guarding it. Margaret flew home the next morning, seat near the window. She watched the clouds drift past, each one briefly distinct before dissolving into the next. A woman across the aisle struggled with her tray table. Margaret leaned over and helped without thinking. Their eyes met. A small smile passed between them. Nothing more. When Margaret returned home, she opened her notebook and wrote about the forum, about sitting in the back, about hearing her own beliefs spoken aloud by strangers and realizing how thin they sounded. She did not absolve herself. She documented. Weeks later, Liberty Air released a quiet update, a standardized intervention protocol adopted across partner airlines. Not branded, not flashy, shared freely. Daniel watched the announcement go live without ceremony. He closed his laptop and leaned back, the familiar sense of unfinished work settling in. Margaret received a call from the center that afternoon. They wanted her to help train new volunteers. She agreed without hesitation. On a late summer flight, Daniel sat beside a man who talked too much about his grandchildren. Daniel listened, laughed at the right moments. The man never asked what he did for a living. Margaret boarded a bus home from the center, tired but steady. She looked out the window at the city she had lived in all her life, seeing it now with edges she hadn't noticed before. The world had not flipped upside down. It had tilted, just enough to make old assumptions slide. And in that slow, deliberate shift, both of them continued forward, not as symbols, not as opposites, but as people learning what it meant to take responsibility for the space they occupied. The cabin was quiet in the way only a final flight of the day could be. Lights dimmed low, voices softened by fatigue and routine. Daniel Brooks sat in his seat long before boarding finished, jacket folded neatly beside him, hands resting on his knees. Outside the window, the runway lights stretched into the dark like a measured promise. He had taken this route dozens of times, but tonight felt different. Not heavier, quieter, as if the noise he had been carrying for years had finally learned how to settle. Passengers filed in slowly, a couple arguing in whispers, a woman holding a paperback with a cracked spine, a man adjusting his hearing aid, careful not to draw attention. Small lives passing through shared space, each believing their story invisible to the others. Daniel watched them with practiced stillness,
3 rows back, Margaret Whitman stepped onto the aircraft and paused. She hesitated just long enough for the flight attendant to look up and smile. "Take your time," the attendant said gently. Margaret nodded, grateful for the tone more than the words. She moved down the aisle without urgency, eyes scanning seat numbers until she found hers. Window. Middle of the cabin. Ordinary. She sat and placed her bag beneath the seat, hands steady now in the way they had not been months ago. She did not notice Daniel at first. When she did, it was only because he stood to help an older man lift a suitcase into the overhead bin. The motion was unremarkable, efficient, kind. The kind of thing no one recorded and no one praised. Margaret's breath caught anyway. Daniel sat back down without looking around, unaware of her gaze. The plane hummed, systems waking. A familiar voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming them aboard. As the aircraft pushed back, Margaret stared out the window, city lights receding. She thought of the first time she had flown alone, decades earlier, dressed carefully, certain that belonging was something you proved with polish and certainty. She knew better now. Belonging was quieter. It asked for less performance and more presence. Daniel closed his eyes briefly as the plane lifted into the sky. He felt the familiar pressure, the gentle insistence of gravity giving way. He thought of the airline as it was now, not perfect, never would be, but honest enough to keep moving. Halfway through the flight, the seatbelt sign chimed off. The cabin shifted. A low murmur returned. Someone laughed softly. Margaret stood to stretch her legs, then hesitated. She turned down the aisle and walked forward, stopping beside Daniel's row. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly. He looked up, surprised, then nodded. "Ms. Whitman, I won't take much of your time," she said. Her voice was steady, not defensive. "I just wanted to say that I'm still doing the work." Daniel studied her face. The lines were the same, the posture different. "I can see that," he said. She swallowed. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't think that's how this works." "No," Daniel agreed. "It isn't." They stood in silence for a moment, the plane carrying them forward through the dark. "I've started speaking to groups," Margaret said. "Small ones, seniors, people who think the world owes them certainty because they've survived it." A faint smile touched her mouth. "I tell them about the seat." Daniel nodded once. Then it mattered. "It did," she said. "It still does." She stepped back, giving him space, and returned to her seat. No resolution, no absolution, just acknowledgement, exchanged and accepted. The rest of the flight passed without incident. Drinks served, trays collected, lights dimmed further. The ordinary beauty of uneventful travel. As they descended, Daniel looked out at the scattered lights below. He thought of all the flights he had taken without recognition, all the times he had been underestimated, ignored, dismissed. He thought of how power revealed itself not in confrontation, but in restraint. Margaret closed her eyes as the wheels touched down, a soft jolt anchoring her. She felt tired, not ashamed, not triumphant, just aware. When the plane reached the gate, passengers rose and gathered their things. Daniel waited, as he often did, letting the rush pass him by. Margaret did the same. Two people choosing patience for different reasons. At the door, the flight attendant smiled at Daniel. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. "Thank you for having me," he replied. Margaret passed moments later. The attendant offered the same smile, the same tone. No hierarchy, no hesitation. Outside the aircraft, the terminal buzzed, indifferent and alive. Daniel adjusted his jacket and walked toward the exit. Margaret turned in the opposite direction, toward the shuttle. Neither looked back. The story did not end with applause or punishment. It ended with movement.
with people carrying what they had learned into spaces where no one would ever know why they moved differently. That was enough.
If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like it, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment about what dignity and belonging mean to you.